fiction. Before SF State, she worked as a lawyer, a professional ballroom dancer, and a veterinary technician. She's married to a commercial fisherman, and she lives in San Francisco. Please welcome Dolly, everybody.
Perfect. Thank you, Nate. Okay. Okay, so, there's like all this wine all over.
Sorry. I put both elbows down and it shifted, and then it flipped out.
Okay, so I am going to read from a memoir that I'm writing right now about my mother's murder. My mother was killed in Connecticut in 1997 when she was walking her dog around the reservoir. And so the memoir is kind of, it's not like a typical murder mystery with like who done it. It's more about how this act plays out in our family. And so this is just a portion of it. It's now a week after my mother's death and a week before Christmas. My father wants all of my mother's clothes out of the house. All of them. My mother was a size 4 at most, 5'7" with size 5 feet, impossible proportions, worthy only of a princess. She has more than 10 closets full of clothes, and my father launches a glass slipper search for the person who can fit into these raiments, these cloths of heaven. There is a chest at the foot of her bed that contains 2 neatly folded stacks of cashmere sweaters that she wore as a teenager. They have 3/4 length sleeves and mother-of-pearl buttons, 10 sweaters in all, off-white and black, lavender and emerald green. My father catches me with my hands in her drawer. "Don't think you're getting those," he warns, his voice low. "Close that drawer." His speech is starting to slur. He spent the morning reading sympathy cards in the living room, a fire in the fireplace, and a glass of scotch on the rocks sweating on the table by his side. He sleeps for several hours every afternoon, waits for cocktail hour, dinner with red and white wine, brandy after dinner, and then more scotch before bed. My Aunt Amelia travels to the liquor store almost every day. My father leaves a thick stack of 20s in the kitchen drawer, along with the car keys. The kitty, he calls it. He wants to be sure Amelia always has enough money for what he needs. With my father watching me unsteadily, I close the sweater drawer. I can see my reflection in the mirror over my mother's bureau. I resemble my mother, but it's as if the fine bone structure of her beauty has become in me expressed as a grotesque. I have her dark eyebrows, but on my face they look heavy, Neanderthal. Her strong jaw on me becomes jowls. I have her full lips, but my mouth looks puffy now, leering, lewd. I see my father watching me in the mirror, and I wonder if he's thinking the same thing. Behind the mirror, there's a black and white baby picture of me in a gleaming silver frame that my mother polished every few months. There's no one in the world who wants that picture now. I leave my father and walk back to my childhood bedroom, pulling the door closed behind me and latching the cast iron lock. The black and white kittens my mother found in the reservoir are sleeping on my bed. I get under the covers with all my clothes on and pull the kittens to me. They snuggle between my chin and my chest, their little bodies warm and vibrating, tiny claws kneading the tender skin of my neck. I'm shivering and I can't get warm, despite the little motorboats with their built-in heaters. This has always been a haunted house for me, a dark and evil place. There were real ghosts who terrified my sister and me as adolescents, turning on lights and TVs, slamming doors, hurling pieces of china across the living room floor during family parties. None of our friends would spend the night. Once, when I was in 7th grade, 2 famous Connecticut ghost hunters came to the house and knocked on the kitchen door. They knew about this house, they told us. It was originally built in 1750, and during the Civil War it had been a prison for enemy soldiers. At least 8 of the prisoners had died here. Terrible deaths. It was their spirits that rattled about the drafty rooms. "Leave them be," the ghost hunters told us. "They won't hurt you as long as you don't rile them up. Your family and the ghosts can coexist." To my mother and my father, this made perfect sense. They laughed at the ghost's antics, treating the spirits like eccentric relatives. And this was not our first ghost. My mother's family had had a beach house with a rice ghost. A young woman who, 100 years ago, had supposedly killed herself after being jilted at the altar. The house was closed up every winter, and when my mother's family opened it up for the summer, the breakfast nook in the kitchen was filled with pounds and pounds of rice. Every year. During cocktail hours on the porch, we could hear the rice ghost walking around the second floor and running up and down the stairs. She was harmless, my mother always told me. It was a shame, really, that she was stuck between this life and the next, unable to move beyond her tragedy, filling the kitchen with rice and asking only that her sorrow be remembered, that attention be paid. These ghosts in our house now are like our rice ghosts, my mother said. Don't bother them and they won't bother you. They just want to spice things up a little. They only scare cowardly people. And indeed, the ghosts seemed most active at holidays and family parties when they had the widest possible audiences. One time, a knife flew off the cheese tray and clattered into the metal wastebasket across the room. Another time, a Buddha statue jumped from his perch on the windowsill into the middle of the oriental rug in the center of the room. One night, the candles on the dining room table lit themselves. My cat had snuck onto the table and her tail caught on fire too, singeing her fur but miraculously sparing her flesh, though the acrid stench lingered for days. Ha ha ha, my parents laughed. What characters. But these ghosts were much darker than the rice ghosts I remembered from our summers on the beach. These ghosts were mean, like playground bullies who prey on the ones who are most afraid, and that was me. I was terrified. I went away to boarding school when I was 13, and it was a blessing and a relief to sleep in modern dorms and live with roommates who snored and no ghosts. When I came home on holidays, I was all by myself with the dark and terrifying spirits, and I couldn't sleep at all. I felt the ghosts mock and sneer at me in my fear. I'd lie awake, my heart pounding, hour after terrifying hour, while the ghosts turned on the electric typewriter, opened and closed the bathroom door, and pulled my nightlights out of their sockets. Sometimes I thought of calling the police, but how could the police help me with bad guys who didn't exist? One night I woke my mother. It was long past midnight, and the ghost kept knocking on the walls, rat-a-tat-tat, pounding, rapping, rattling, on and on and on. I was out of my mind with panic. I thought I was going to die of the fear. Go back to bed, my mother told me. Go to sleep. The ghosts are only playing with you. They're trying to get your goat. They're harmless. The only demons you're scared of are imaginary ones, inside yourself. But my mother was wrong. There were demons in the house, dark spirits that hovered at the edge of my mother's life, boys and potent. I have 2 photographs, taken one right after another, of my sister and me. We are seated on a couch in front of a window in my mother's living room. There are 2 different and distinct spirits in the windows behind us. Behind me, there's a woman with long hair, a lace collar buttoned to her chin, and a circular medallion hanging from her neck. Behind my sister, there is a red, pig-faced demon with a snout, pointy ears, and black holes for eyes. I spent most of my 20s crawling and grafting my way to a life free of these dark forces, and in many ways, I thought I had made it. I lived in San Francisco, thousands of miles away from this New England haunted house, by the edge of a different ocean, in a crowded apartment building in the city where there's no parking, noisy neighbors, and all sorts of cooking smells, lights, sirens in the middle of the night, but no ghosts, no dark spirits, just life, my life. I never ever had trouble sleeping, either alone or sharing my bed. Sometimes I brought out the pictures of these spirits to show my West Coast friends. They found it hard to believe that these were actual ghosts. They grasped at more and more ludicrous theories to explain these 2 presences in the window behind my sister and me. I never tried to convince my friends. It seemed as silly to me as trying to convince them of the existence of rain, or trees, or the moon. And now my mother's been murdered. The spirits had their dark victory. On the day of her death, hours before I received the phone call from my father, I was working in my pink office in the center of the Metronome Ballroom, calculating the week's payroll with our bookkeeper, Summer. Our desks were against opposite walls, and when I looked up, I saw, standing in the corner, a ghost from my mother's house. He was dressed in a collarless shirt and overalls and held his hat in his hands. He looked down at his hat, and then he vanished. Summer, did you see that? I asked, incredulous. It was the first and only time I had seen any sort of ghost in California. See what? She asked. Never mind, I said. I thought then I had imagined it. We were preparing for the Christmas show, and I had been at rehearsal late the night before. Maybe my fatigue had made me imagine the ghostly presence. But now, I'm not so sure. Now I think that figure really was a ghost from my mother's house, come to tell me that my mother was dead. And I think that his final appearance in my life, with his hat in his hands and his eyes turned down, was an act of great decency and respect. Maybe after all those years of terrifying me in the dark, a spirit had emerged that understood the sorrow that was about to descend on us. Who better than a spirit who, if the ghost hunters are to be believed, had himself died a violent death and was stuck between this life and the next? Who better to show up at this terrible moment to warn me of the darkness that was still to come?